to the people, or in goods pernicious in their effects, or by financial speculations, or by acquiring land at a low price, the value of which is increased by the needs of the population, or by an industry ruinous to the health and life of those employed in it, or by military or civil service of the state, or by any employment which trades on men's evil instincts, a single fortune acquired in any of these ways, not only with the sanction, but even with the approbation of the leading men in society, and masked with an ostentation of philanthropy, corrupts men incomparably more than millions of thefts and robberies committed against the recognized forms of law and punishable as crimes. A single execution carried out by prosperous, educated men, uninfluenced by passion, with the approbation and assistance of Christian ministers, and represented as something necessary and even just, is infinitely more corrupting and brutalizing to men than thousands of murders committed by uneducated working people under the influence of passion. An execution such as was proposed by Jurkowski, which would produce even a sentiment of religious emotion in the spectators, would be one of the most perverting actions imaginable. See Volume 4 of the works of Jurkowski. Every war, even the most humanely conducted, with all its ordinary consequences, the destruction of harvests, robberies, the license and debauchery, and the murder with the justifications of its necessity and justice, the exaltation and glorification of military exploits, the worship of the flag, the patriotic sentiments, the feigned solicitude for the wounded, and so on, does more in 1 year to pervert men's minds than thousands of robberies, murders, and arsons perpetuated during hundreds of years by individual men under the influence of passion. The luxurious expenditure of a single respectable and so-called honorable family, even within the conventional limits, consuming as it does the produce of as many days of labor as would suffice to provide for thousands living in privation near, does more to pervert men's minds than thousands of the violent orgies and coarse tradespeople, officers and workmen of drunken and debauched habits, who smash up glasses and crockery for amusement. One solemn religious procession, one service, one sermon from the altar steps or the pulpit in which the preacher does not believe, produces incomparably more evil than thousands of swindling tricks, adulterations of food, and so on. We talk of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, but the hypocrisy of our society far surpasses the comparatively innocent hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They had at least an external rule, the fulfillment of which hinders them from seeing their obligations to their neighbors. Moreover, these obligations were not nearly so clearly defined in their day. Nowadays, we have no such religious law to exonerate us from our duties to our neighbors. I am speaking now of the coarse and ignorant persons who still fancy their sins can be absolved by confession to a priest or by the absolution of the Pope. On the contrary, the law of the gospel, which we all profess in one form or another, directly defines these duties. Besides, the duties which had been then only vaguely and mystically expressed by a few prophets have now been so clearly formulated, have become such truisms, that they are repeated even by schoolboys and journalists, and so it would seem that men of today cannot pretend that they do not know these duties. A man of the modern world who profits by the order of things based on violence, and at the same time protests that he loves his neighbor and does not observe what he is doing in all his daily life to his neighbor, is like a brigand who has spent his life in robbing men, and who, caught at last, knife in hand, in the very act of striking his shrieking victim, should declare that he had no idea that what he was doing was disagreeable to the man he had robbed and was prepared to murder. Just as this robber and murderer could not deny what was evident to everyone, So it would seem that a man living upon the privations of the oppressed classes cannot persuade himself and others that he desires the welfare of those he plunders, and that he does not know how the advantages he enjoys are obtained. It is impossible to convince ourselves that we do not know that there are 100,000 men in prison in Russia alone to guarantee the security of our property and tranquility, and that we do not know of the law tribunals in which we take part, and which, at our initiative, condemn those who have attacked our property and our security to prison, exile, and forced labor, whereby men no worse than those who condemn them are ruined and corrupted, or that we do not know that we only possess all that we do possess because it has been acquired and is defended for us by murder and violence. We cannot pretend that we do not see the armed policeman who marches up and down beneath our windows to guarantee our security while we eat our luxurious dinner or look at the new piece at the theater, or that we are unaware of the existence of the soldiers who will make their appearance with guns and cartridges directly our property is attacked. We know very well that we are only allowed to go on eating our dinner, to finish seeing the new play, or to enjoy to the end the ball, the Christmas fete, the promenade, the races, or the hunt, thanks to the policeman's revolver or the soldier's rifle, which will shoot down the famished outcast who has been robbed of his share, and who looks round the corner with covetous eyes at our pleasures, ready to interpret them instantly. Were not the policeman and the soldier there prepared to run up at our first call for help? And therefore, just as a brigand caught in broad daylight in the act cannot persuade us that he did not lift his knife in order to rob his victim of his purse and had no thought of killing him, we too, it would seem, cannot persuade ourselves or others that the soldiers and policemen around us are not to guard us, but only for defense against foreign foes, and to regulate traffic and fêtes and reviews. We cannot persuade ourselves and others that we do not know that men do not like dying of hunger, bereft of the right to gain their subsistence from the earth on which they live, that they do not like working underground, in the water, or in stifling heat, for 10 to 14 hours a day, at night in factories to manufacture objects for our pleasure. One would imagine it impossible to deny what is so obvious. Yet it is denied. Still, there are, among the rich, especially among the young, and among women, persons whom I am glad to meet more and more frequently, who, when they are shown in what way and at what cost their pleasures are purchased, do not try to conceal the truth, but, hiding their head in their hands, cry, "Oh, don't speak of that. If it is so, life is impossible." But though there are such sincere people who, even though they cannot renounce their fault, at least see it, the vast majority of the men of the modern world have so entered into the parts they play in their hypocrisy that they boldly deny what is staring everyone in the face. All that is unjust, they say. No one forces the people to work for the landowners and manufacturers. That is an affair for free contract. Great properties and fortunes are necessary because they provide an organized work for the working classes, and labor in the factories and workshops is not at all the terrible thing you make it out to be, even if there are some abuses in factories. The government and the public are taking steps to obviate them and to make the labor of the factory workers much easier and even agreeable. The working classes are accustomed to physical labor and are, so far, fit for nothing else. The poverty of the people is not the result of private property in land, nor of capitalistic oppression, but of other causes. It is the result of the ignorance, brutality, and intemperance of the people. And we men in authority who are striving against this impoverishment of the people by wise legislation, we capitalists who are combating it by the extension of useful inventions, we clergymen by religious instruction, and we liberals by the formation of trade unions and the diffusion of education, are in this way increasing the prosperity of the people without changing our own positions. We do not want all to be as poor as the poor. We want all to be as rich as the rich. As for the assertion that men are ill-treated and murdered to force them to work for the profit of the rich, that is a pacifism. The army is only called out against the mob when the people, in ignorance of their own interests, make disturbances and destroy the tranquility necessary for the public welfare. In the same way, too, it is necessary to keep in restraint the malefactors for whom the prisons and gallows are established. We ourselves wish to suppress these forms of punishment and are working in that direction. Hypocrisy in our day is supported on two sides, by false religion and by false science, and it has reached such proportions that if we were not living in the midst, we could not believe that men could attain such a pitch of self-deception. Men of the present day have come into such an extraordinary condition, their hearts are so hardened, that seeing they see not, hearing they do not hear, and understand not. Men have long been living in antagonism to their conscience. If it were not for hypocrisy, they could not go on living such a life. The social organization in opposition to their conscience only continues to exist because it is disguised by hypocrisy. And the greater the divergence between actual life and men's conscience, the greater the extension of hypocrisy. But even hypocrisy has its limits, and it seems to me that we have reached those limits in the present day. Every man of the present day with the Christian principles assimilated involuntarily in his conscience finds himself in precisely the position of a man asleep who dreams that he is obliged to do something which even in his dream he knows he ought not to do. He knows this in the depths of his conscience, and all the same he seems unable to change his position. He cannot stop and cease doing what he ought not to do. And just as in a dream, his position, becoming more and more painful, at last reaches such a pitch of intensity that he begins sometimes to doubt the reality of what is passing, and makes a moral effort to shake off the nightmare which is oppressing him. This is just the condition of the average man of our Christian society. He feels that all that he does himself and that is done around him is something absurd, hideous, impossible, and opposed to his conscience. He feels that his position is becoming more and more unendurable and reaching a crisis of intensity. It is not possible that we modern men, with the Christian sense of human dignity and equality permeating us soul and body, with our need for peaceful association and unity between nations, should really go on living in such a way that every joy, gratification we have is bought by the sufferings, by the lives of our brother men, and moreover, that we should be every instant within a hair's breadth of falling on one another, nation against nation, like wild beasts, mercilessly destroying men's lives and labor, only because some benign diplomat or ruler says or writes some stupidity to another equally benign diplomat or ruler. It is impossible. Yet every man of our day sees that this is so, and awaits the calamity. And the situation becomes more and more insupportable. And as men who is dreaming does not believe that what appears to him can be truly the reality and tries to wake up from the actual real world again, so the average man of modern days cannot, in the bottom of his heart, believe that the awful position in which he is placed, and which is growing worse and worse, can be the reality, and tries to wake up to a true, real life as it exists in his conscience. And just as the dreamer needs only make a moral effort and ask himself, isn't it a dream? and the situation which seemed to him so hopeless will instantly disappear, and he will wake up to peaceful and happy reality. So the man of the modern world need only make a moral effort to doubt the reality presented to him by his own hypocrisy and the general hypocrisy around him, and to ask himself, isn't it all a delusion? And he will at once, like the dreamer awakened, feel himself transported from an imaginary and dreadful world to the true, calm, and happy reality. And to do this, a man need accomplish no great feats or exploits. He need only make a moral effort. But can a man make this effort? According to the existing theory so essential to support hypocrisy, man is not free and cannot change his life. Man cannot change his life because he is not free. He is not free because all his actions are conditioned by previously existing causes, and whatever the man may do, there are always some causes or other through which he does these or those acts, and therefore man cannot be free and change his life, say the champions of the metaphysics of hypocrisy. And they would be perfectly right if man were a creature without conscience and incapable of moving toward the truth. That is to say, if after recognizing a new truth, man always remained at the same stage of moral development, but man is a creature with a conscience and capable of attaining a higher and higher degree of truth. And therefore, even if man is not free as regards performing these or those acts, because there exists a previous cause for every act, the very causes of the acts, consisting as they do for the man of conscience of the recognition of this or that truth, are within his own control. So that though man may not be free as regards the performance of his actions, he is free as regards the foundation on which they are performed. Just as the mechanician who is not free to modify the movement of his locomotive when it is in motion is free to regulate the machine beforehand so as to determine what the movement is to be. Whatever the conscious man does, he acts just as he does, and not otherwise, only because he recognizes that to act as he is acting is in accord with the truth, or because he has recognized it at some previous time, and is now only through inertia, through habit, acting in accordance with his previous recognition of truth. In any case, the cause of his action is not to be found in any given previous fact, but in the consciousness of a given relation to truth, and the consequent recognition of this or that fact as a sufficient basis for action. Whether a man eats or does not eat, works or rests, runs, risks, or avoids them, if he has a conscience, he acts thus only because he considers it right and rational, because he considers that to act thus is in harmony with truth, or else because he has made this reflection in the past. The recognition or non-recognition of a certain truth depends not on external causes, but on certain other causes within the man himself, so that at times under external conditions apparently very favorable for the recognition of truth, one man will not recognize it, and another, on the contrary, under the most unfavorable conditions, will, without apparent cause, recognize it. As it is said in the Gospel, no man can come unto me except the Father which hath sent me draw him. That is to say, the recognition of truth, which is the cause of all the manifestations of human life, does not depend on external phenomena, but on certain inner spiritual characteristics of the man which escape our observation. And therefore man, though not free in his acts, always feels himself free in what is the motive of his acts, the recognition or non-recognition of truth. And he feels himself independent not only of facts external to his own personality, but even of his own actions. Thus, a man who, under the influence of passion, has committed an act contrary to the truth he recognizes, remains none the less free to recognize it or not to recognize it. That is, He can, by refusing to recognize the truth, regard his action as necessary and justifiable, or he may recognize the truth and regard his act as wrong, and censure himself for it. Thus, a gambler or a drunkard who does not resist temptation and yields to his passion is still free to recognize gambling and drunkenness as wrong, or to regard them as a harmless pastime. In the first case, even if he does not at once get over his passion, he gets the more free from it, the more sincerely he recognizes the truth about it. In the second case, he will be strengthened in his vice and will deprive himself of every possibility of shaking it off. In the same way, a man who has made his escape alone from a house on fire, not having had the courage to save his friend, remains free, recognizing the truth that a man ought to save the life of another, even at the risk of his own, to regard his action as bad and to censure himself for it, or, not recognizing this truth, to regard his action as natural and necessary and to justify it to himself. In the first case, if he recognizes the truth in spite of his departure from it, he prepares for himself in the future a whole series of acts of self-sacrifice, necessarily flowing from this recognition of the truth. In the second case, a whole series of egotistic acts. Not that a man is always free to recognize or to refuse to recognize every truth. There are truths which he has recognized long before, or which have been handed down to him by education and tradition, and accepted by him on faith, and to follow these truths has become a habit, a second nature within him. And there are truths only vaguely, as it were distantly apprehended by him. The man is not free to refuse to recognize the first, nor to recognize the second class of truths. But there are truths of a third kind, which have not yet become an unconscious motive of action, but yet have been revealed so clearly to him that he cannot pass them by, and is inevitably obliged to do one thing or the other, to recognize or not to recognize them. And it is in regard to these truths that the man's freedom manifests itself. Every man during his life finds himself in regard to truth in the position of a man walking in the darkness with light thrown before him by the lantern he carries. He does not see what is not yet lighted up by the lantern. He does not see what he has passed, which is hidden in the darkness. But at every stage of his journey, he sees what is lighted up by the lantern, and he can always choose one side or the other of the road. There are always unseen truths not yet revealed to the man's intellectual vision, and there are other truths outlived, forgotten, and assimilated by him. And there are also certain truths that rise up before the light of his reason and require his recognition. And it is in the recognition or non-recognition of these truths that what we call his freedom is manifested. All the difficulty and seeming insolubility of the question of the freedom of man results from those who tried to solve the question imagining man statutory in his relation to the truth. Man is certainly not free if we imagine him stationary, and if we forget that the life of a man and of humanity is nothing but a continual movement from darkness into light, from a lower stage of truth to a higher, from a truth more alloyed with errors to a truth more purified from them. Man would not be free if he knew no truth at all, and in the same way he would not be free and would not even have any idea of freedom if the whole truth which was to guide him in life had been revealed once for all to him in all its purity, without any admixture of error. But man is not stationary in regard to truth, but every individual man, as he passes through life and humanity as a whole, in the same way, is continually learning to know a greater and greater degree of truth, and growing more and more free from error. And therefore men are in a threefold relation to truth. Some truths have been so assimilated by them that they have become the unconscious basis of action. Others are only just on the point of being revealed to him, and a third class, though not yet assimilated by him, have been revealed to him with sufficient clearness to force him to decide either to recognize them or to refuse to recognize them. These, then, are the truths which man is free to recognize or to refuse to recognize. End of chapter 12c.